I woke up after emergency surgery not to a warm hug, but to an alert about an attempted charge on my account. While my parents and brother posted beach photos from Cancun, a strange woman signed my visitor log 4 nights in a row. She came late, sat outside the glass, and brought a file box my mother had forbidden mentioning for years. Soon, my family will realize they left the wrong person behind. My name is Nora Ashmore. I am 34 years old, and I am the Senior Contract Compliance Manager at Aldercrest Recovery Group. My company is a private corporate firm that specializes in medical supply chain crisis management. We handle the disasters that the general public never even hears about. If a major hospital network on the East Coast suddenly realizes they are going to run out of surgical mesh in 48 hours, or if a critical shipment of sterile saline gets held up at international customs due to a regulatory technicality, my team is the one that steps in to fix it. The job demands absolute precision, nerves of steel, and nights where sleep is nothing more than a fleeting luxury. I spend my waking hours staring at endless compliance spreadsheets, negotiating brutal penalty clauses with overseas manufacturers, and ensuring that multi-million-dollar logistics networks do not collapse under the weight of their own inefficiency. I am exceptionally good at what I do. I am competent. I am reliable. In fact, reliable is the exact word everyone in my life uses to describe me. On the surface, the Ashmore family is the absolute picture of upper-middle-class American stability. My father, Richard, is a stern, imposing man who wears neatly tailored suits and speaks in a booming, authoritative voice that naturally commands respect. My mother, Elaine, is eternally polished. Her hair is always perfectly coiffed, her outfits are meticulously coordinated, and her social calendar is always completely full. And then there is my younger brother, Gavin. Gavin is undeniably attractive, armed with a silver tongue, an effortless charm, and an easy smile that gets him out of any trouble. Ever since we were young children, he has been officially designated by my parents as the one with the big future. He is supposed to be the visionary, the creative risk-taker, the golden boy who just needs that one right break to finally change the world and make us all incredibly wealthy. But beneath that glossy, carefully maintained veneer, the reality of our family dynamic is entirely different. In truth, I am the one who is constantly being drained dry to keep the Ashmore facade from crumbling. I am the family's unofficial, non-consensual emergency fund. I am the silent safety net that is expected to catch them every single time they fall. Last year, I paid off Gavin's maxed-out credit cards to save his precious credit score from completely tanking. 2 months ago, I had to cover the failed security deposit for his latest disastrous startup venture. When my parents decided they absolutely needed a massive roof repair and a kitchen renovation, they did not go to the bank to apply for a loan. They came straight to me. It is always framed as a minor, temporary arrangement. "It is just an advance for a few weeks, sweetheart," my mother would say, patting my hand gently. "We will have it right back to you by the 1st of the month." But those few weeks inevitably turn into months. The months turn into years, and the money never actually finds its way back to my checking account. The truly insidious part is that my parents never outright demand the money from me. That would be too crude, too easily recognizable as exploitation. Instead, they expertly use the one specific weapon they know I have absolutely no defense against: validation. It is the one thing I have desperately craved from them since I was a little girl standing quietly in Gavin's massive shadow. Whenever they need access to my bank account, they suddenly truly see me. They shower me with praise. They commend my strength. They talk about how proud they are of my fierce independence. "We are just so incredibly proud of you, Nora," my mother said to me over the phone last Tuesday, her voice dripping with practiced, honeyed affection. "You are so capable and successful. We would never, ever ask if it were not an absolute emergency, but we know we can always count on our rock. You are literally saving this family, darling." With those sweet words, they expertly twist their own financial irresponsibility into my moral duty. If I dare to say no to them, I am not just holding back cash. I am breaking my mother's fragile heart, disrespecting my father's quiet pride, and directly sabotaging my brother's brilliant, inevitable future. They feed me tiny, calculated scraps of approval, and I pay for those scraps with massive chunks of my hard-earned salary. Gavin, on the other hand, does not even bother with the emotional guilt trips or the fake gratitude. He simply views my savings account as a natural extension of his own wallet, a guaranteed, bottomless buffer for his endless parade of flashy, hollow business plans. Over the past 5 years, he has pitched me everything from a luxury travel video blog to a boutique wellness resort brand, and most recently, an exclusive high-tier investor conference that never actually materialized. His dreams are always incredibly expensive, and they always require a massive injection of upfront capital. "It is just seed money, Nora," he told me confidently during a recent lunch that I ended up paying for. "When the resort brand officially launches, I am going to give you a 10% stake in the company. You just have to open your eyes and see the vision." He never apologizes when the vision inevitably fails. He never acknowledges the late nights I work just to refill the accounts he casually drains. To Gavin, my money is simply the standard cost of doing his business, and I am the silent, invisible investor who is strictly forbidden from ever asking for a return on investment. This invisible, crushing burden had been physically breaking me down for many months. The warning signs of total collapse were all there, practically screaming at me to stop and rest. I had developed a chronic, gnawing pain in my stomach that felt like a hot fist constantly twisting my insides. I experienced sudden, terrifying bouts of lightheadedness whenever I stood up from my desk too fast. My heartbeat would often race without warning, fluttering erratically against my ribs in the dark, quiet hours of the early morning. Yet, I stubbornly ignored all of it. I kept going into the office. I kept authorizing the wire transfers. I kept driving 30 miles across town through heavy traffic to my parents' house after a grueling 14-hour shift just to fix a minor issue with their internet router or help my mother format a simple email. I was running entirely on fumes, black coffee, and the deeply toxic belief that if I just kept moving forward, I would not fall apart. The night I finally broke did not feature a loud, dramatic argument or a cinematic, weeping tragedy. It happened on a random Tuesday evening, right in the middle of a highly stressful, urgent internal company conference call. I was standing in the middle of my glass-walled office, desperately trying to salvage a massive supply contract that had been flagged for severe, potentially catastrophic documentation errors. The overseas manufacturer was aggressively threatening to pull out of the deal completely, and tens of millions of dollars of critical medical inventory hung delicately in the balance. While my department director yelled frantically through the speakerphone on my desk, my personal cell phone lying right next to it lit up brightly. It was a text message from my mother, then a second one, and then a third. "Please tell me you sent the money for Gavin's flight. The travel agent is going to cancel the entire booking in 1 hour. Transfer the rest today, please." I stood there and stared blankly at the glowing screen. The harsh white text began to blur and swim before my eyes. A sudden, unimaginably sharp cramp ripped violently through my abdomen. The pain was so intense and absolute that it instantly stole all the breath from my lungs. I tried to stand up straighter, my fingers gripping the smooth wooden edge of my desk so hard my knuckles turned white. The complex compliance spreadsheet on my computer monitor dissolved into a blinding, meaningless sea of white light. A heavy, sickeningly sweet, distinctly metallic taste suddenly flooded my mouth. I tried to open my lips to speak, to tell my frantic boss that I needed a brief moment, but my vocal cords completely refused to work. My knees buckled abruptly beneath me. I did not even have the physical strength or the reflexes to catch myself. I plummeted downward, collapsing heavily onto the cold, hard, industrial carpet of my office floor. As the muffled, panicked sound of my boss asking if I was still on the line slowly faded into a distant, underwater echo, and my cell phone continued to buzz relentlessly and selfishly against the wood of my desk, the entire world went completely dark. My old, exhausting life shattered entirely right there on the office floor. completely breaking apart long before my exhausted brain could even begin to comprehend what had just happened to me. The transition from unconsciousness to reality did not happen gracefully. It was a violent, disorienting tear through a thick fog of anesthesia and deep physical trauma. The first thing I registered was not a sight or a sound, but a sharp, burning agony slicing straight down the center of my abdomen. Then came the steady, rhythmic chiming of a cardiac monitor, a sound so aggressively sterile it made my teeth ache. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt like it was coated in dry, cracked sand. I peeled my eyelids open against the harsh, unforgiving glare of fluorescent hospital lights. A doctor was standing at the foot of my bed, reviewing a thick paper chart on a clipboard. When he noticed I was awake, his expression did not soften into the warm, comforting smile you see in television dramas. His face remained drawn, serious, and deeply exhausted. He stepped closer and explained the situation with clinical precision. I had suffered a severe gastric hemorrhage, an ulcer that had finally ruptured under the immense, crushing weight of chronic stress. That massive internal bleeding, combined with months of profound exhaustion, had triggered a dangerous cardiac arrhythmia. My heart had literally forgotten how to beat in a steady rhythm because it had been running a marathon for over a year without a single drop of water. "You are incredibly lucky to be breathing right now," the doctor told me, his voice a low, heavy rumble. "If the paramedics had arrived 20 minutes later, you would have bled out completely, or your heart would have gone into fatal failure. You pushed your body miles past the absolute limit of human endurance." I nodded weakly, absorbing the chilling reality that I had almost died on the floor of my office. Once the doctor finished his assessment and left the room, the silence closed in around me. It was a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet. I turned my head slowly, fighting the stiffness in my neck, and looked around the intensive care room. It was entirely, perfectly empty. There was no heavy wool coat draped carelessly over the uncomfortable vinyl visitor chair. There was no oversized leather tote bag resting on the floor. There was no colorful, overpriced arrangement of flowers from the hospital gift shop sitting on the windowsill. There was nothing. The space was incredibly clean, deeply sanitary, and utterly vacant. The absolute lack of any personal presence felt like a physical slap across the face. The emptiness was so deliberate it was insulting. My only companions were a clear plastic water cup with a bendable straw and a tower of digital machines keeping track of my vital signs. A few hours later, the door swung open quietly, and the night nurse walked in. Her name tag read, Renee. She had kind eyes and moved with a quiet, efficient grace, adjusting my intravenous drip and checking the thick gauze taped over my surgical incision. I watched her for a moment before I finally gathered enough saliva to ask the question that was sitting like a heavy stone in my chest. "Did anyone come?" I asked, my voice cracking into a dry, pathetic rasp. Renee paused. She did not look directly at me right away, busying herself with the blood pressure cuff instead. That hesitation was an answer all on its own. "Your family did stop by," she said softly, her tone carefully measured, clearly trained in the art of delivering bad news without causing a panic. "How long?" I pressed, my gaze locked onto her hands. Renee finally looked up, her expression a mix of professional neutrality and deep, hidden pity. "They were here for less than half an hour." They had not even stayed long enough to hear the chief surgeon explain the full extent of my condition. Renee reluctantly filled in the gaps when I refused to let the subject drop. My mother, Elaine, had marched up to the nurses' station and demanded to speak to the billing department, her only concern being where to sign the insurance authorization forms, so she would not be held financially liable for the emergency room fees. My father, Richard, had pulled a junior resident aside in the hallway. He did not ask if I was in pain. He did not ask if I was scared. He strictly demanded a timeline, asking exactly how many days it would take for me to return to normal and get back to my regular routine. And Gavin, my golden, brilliant brother, he had not spoken to the hospital staff at all. With trembling fingers, I reached for my personal belongings tray and pulled out my cell phone. The screen was cracked from when I had dropped it during my collapse, I had one single unread text message from him, sent several hours ago. Let me know when you are okay. Boarding now. No phone call. No frantic voicemails begging to hear my voice. Just a casual, offhand text message, as if my brush with death were nothing more than a slight inconvenience that had mildly irritated him. Against my better judgment, I opened a social media app. The algorithm immediately pushed Gavin's latest post to the top of my feed. The image was painfully vibrant against the dim lighting of my hospital room. It was a high-resolution photograph of a frosted glass filled with an amber cocktail, resting on a small wooden table. In the background, Gavin's bare feet were stretched out over pristine white sand, with the brilliant turquoise waters of the ocean rolling behind him. The caption beneath the photo was neatly typed, "Finding peace and family support in Cancun. Big moves coming soon." I stared at the glowing screen until my eyes burned. The sharp, burning pain of my surgical incision faded into complete insignificance, entirely swallowed up by a much deeper, colder agony. The realization settled into my bones like winter frost. They had not missed their flight because of an accident. They had not been forced to leave my side against their will. They had stood in this very hospital, looked at the surgical tubes running out of my arms, looked at the blood bags hanging above my bed, and they had consciously calculated the odds. They weighed my survival against the cost of non-refundable first-class plane tickets and a luxury resort reservation, and they simply chose the beach. They chose to go. I locked my phone and placed it face down on the tray. I did not cry. Crying would require energy I simply did not possess, and tears felt entirely too warm for the absolute ice running through my veins at that moment. It was not until the deep, quiet hours of the following night that the atmosphere in the room shifted. I was staring blankly at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic hum of the building's ventilation system, when Renee came in for her 2 o'clock rounds. As she checked the monitors, she sighed quietly, seemingly talking to herself as much as to me. "At least you have one dedicated guardian angel," she murmured, jotting down numbers on her digital tablet. I turned my head slightly. "What do you mean?" Renee looked surprised, realizing I was awake and had heard her. "Oh, I just meant the woman outside, the one who came by last night, right after your parents left." My heart gave a weak, strange flutter. "A woman, who was she?" "I am not entirely sure," Renee admitted, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "She came to the nurses' station very late. She did not cause a fuss, did not demand to be let in, and she never claimed to be a family member. She just asked exactly which room you were in. When I told her you were not receiving visitors, she just nodded. She walked down the hall and sat in that uncomfortable plastic chair right outside your glass viewing window. She sat there for hours, just watching the door, quiet as a mouse. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning swept through the room. I was far too weak to disconnect myself from the machines, pull myself out of the bed, and drag my aching body out into the sterile hallway to look. I was trapped under the thin hospital sheets. But from that moment on, I could not stop staring at the heavy door of my room. I lay there in the dark, my eyes fixed on the small rectangular window embedded in the wood. I felt a sudden suffocating mix of fear and intense curiosity. My family had always been a perfectly sealed vault of polished lies and convenient omissions. But as I watched the shadows shift in the hallway outside, I felt a deep, undeniable certainty settling in my chest. Something very old, something they had buried deep in the ground a long time ago, was finally digging its way out, and it was sitting right outside my door. The second night in the intensive care unit dragged on with an agonizing, heavy slowness that only hospitals at 3 o'clock in the morning can produce. The heavy painkillers they were pumping into my veins made the edges of my vision blur, but my mind was stuck in a loop of sharp, jagged anxiety. I could not stop staring at the heavy door of my room. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow detach itself from the dim fluorescent lighting of the hallway. A figure stepped into the pale wedge of light outside my door. It was a woman, even through the distorted, reinforced glass of the viewing window. Her rigid posture commanded immediate attention. She stood completely upright, her spine straight as a steel rod. She was wearing a thick, dark gray overcoat that looked perfectly tailored, and her bright silver hair was pulled back tightly into a neat, severe style at the nape of her neck. But it was not her appearance that made my breath catch in my raw throat. It was what she was holding, clutched tightly against her chest, her hands wrapped around it securely as if it were a highly fragile artifact, was a box. It looked like an incredibly old, heavy document file, the kind used for legal archives, with its corners worn down to the raw brown leather from years of handling. She did not attempt to turn the brass handle of my door. She brought no brightly colored balloons, no glossy magazines, and no polite, meaningless greeting cards. She simply lowered herself into the hard, uncomfortable plastic chair stationed directly outside my room. She sat with the absolute stillness of a sentinel, holding that box on her lap, acting as though she were guarding something incredibly precious from suddenly disappearing into the night. When Renee, the night nurse, came into my room a few hours later to check the intravenous drip, the chair out in the hallway was empty again. I waited until she finished recording my blood pressure before I spoke. The woman outside," I rasped, my throat feeling like it was lined with crushed glass. "Did she say anything to you?" Renee paused, her brow furrowing slightly in the dim monitor light. She looked over her shoulder toward the door before turning back to me. "She's very polite, but her behavior is highly unusual. Most people who wait outside an intensive care unit all night want continuous updates on heart rates, oxygen levels, or surgical outcomes. She never asks a single question about your medical chart or your physical health." "What does she ask?" I demanded, fighting the urge to cough. Renee lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "The strangest thing. She always asks the exact same question right before she leaves the ward at dawn. She looks at me and says, 'Is she awake long enough to sign paperwork herself yet?' A sharp, electric spike of pure adrenaline hit my chest, causing the cardiac monitor beside my bed to chirp in rapid response. Someone completely outside my immediate bloodline was closely, silently monitoring my cognitive ability to execute legal documents. That question meant this strange woman knew there was a severe financial or legal landmine waiting for me the second the heavy anesthesia completely cleared my system. By the time the third night rolled around, my mind was racing far too fast for the prescribed sedatives to drag me under. When the digital clock on the wall hit 2 in the morning, I heard the faint, distinct rustle of heavy wool fabric out in the corridor. I immediately closed my eyes, leaving just a microscopic slit open through my lashes, forcing my breathing to remain slow and even to feign a deep, medicated sleep. The woman stepped right up to the glass window. This time, the angle of the hallway light illuminated her face perfectly. It was a face lined with advanced age and an undeniable, rigid hardness. Yet, her expression as she looked through the glass at my sleeping form was entirely startling. It was not the soft, condescending pity that healthy people usually reserve for the critically ill. It was a profound, heavy heartbreak. She looked at me with the silent devastation of someone who had been forced to stand on the opposite shore for a decade, waiting far too long for permission to finally cross the water and approach. She stayed standing at that window for exactly 45 minutes, never taking her eyes off my face, her gloved fingers constantly tracing the worn leather edges of that mysterious file box. The real terror, however, did not fully set in until the following noon. The chemical fog in my brain had finally lifted enough for me to request my personal laptop from the hospital security lockbox. I needed to check my work emails, driven by years of ingrained corporate panic, but my internet browser automatically opened directly to my personal email inbox first. Sitting right at the very top of the screen was an urgent, automated security alert from my primary banking institution. The subject line warned of an unrecognized login attempt on my account. I clicked the email, my hands suddenly trembling so violently I could barely control the trackpad. The security report detailed that someone had attempted to access my main checking account and my emergency savings using an older tablet device. I stared at the listed IP address. I instantly recognized the string of numbers. It was the specific network router located inside my parents' house in the suburbs. I forced myself to look at the exact timestamp of the login attempt. It had occurred exactly 48 hours ago, right in the middle of the afternoon. That was the precise window of time when I had been lying unconscious on a cold operating table, my stomach cut open, my heart failing, entirely dependent on machines to keep me breathing. I did not scream. I did not throw the laptop across the sterile room. Instead, a wave of cold, absolute clarity washed over me, instantly freezing the blood in my veins. The agonizing puzzle pieces slammed together in my mind. My family had not merely decided to abandon me for a luxury beach vacation because they were selfish, shallow people. They had stood over my hospital bed, seen me heavily sedated and strapped to life support, and realized it was the perfect, uninterrupted window of opportunity. They needed me incapacitated. They needed me unconscious just long enough to execute a financial maneuver I would never have approved while awake. I pressed the red nurse call button with lethal precision. When the daytime charge nurse hurried into the room, I did not waste time with pleasantries. "I need you to lock down my entire medical and visitor file immediately," I instructed, my voice ringing out surprisingly steady and sharp. "I am officially revoking all medical disclosure authorizations and financial contact permissions for my parents and my brother. If anyone claiming to be related to me calls this desk or shows up at that door, you tell them absolutely nothing. I also need to use the secure hospital landline right now." Within 30 minutes, I had systematically frozen every single bank account attached to my name. I changed every two-factor authentication code, routing them to a brand new burner phone number I set up right there in the hospital bed. I placed a hard, restrictive fraud alert on my Social Security number, blocking any new lines of credit from being opened. Later that evening, when the shift changed, Renee returned to my room. She stopped dead in the doorway, noticing the drastic shift in the atmosphere immediately. I was sitting completely upright against the pillows, the laptop pushed aside, my eyes sharp, focused, and waiting. She saw that the pathetic haze of the abandoned victim had completely burned off, entirely replaced by the hypervigilance of a woman preparing for war. "You are looking much sharper tonight," Renee noted gently, stepping inside and checking the newly updated, highly restricted visitation chart at the end of my bed. "I need to know," I said, looking her dead in the eye, refusing to let her look away. "The visitor log at the front reception desk. You told me she signed it every single night. What is the exact name of the woman sitting outside my door?" Renee hesitated. She looked at the closed door, perhaps sensing the dangerous, electric tension radiating from my side of the room. She reached into the pocket of her blue scrubs and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a covert photocopy of the sign-in sheet she had secretly made for me. She handed it over without saying a word. I unfolded the paper. I looked down at the neat, aggressively sharp cursive writing pressed into the visitor column. The letters seemed to jump off the page and strike me right in the chest. Lydia Voss. The breath completely caught in my throat. I had not heard that specific name spoken aloud in over 20 years. It was a name that was strictly, furiously banned inside the Ashmore household. It was the name my mother, Elaine, would spit out through violently clenched teeth whenever she had consumed too much white wine at family dinners, her perfectly manicured face twisting with an ugly, venomous hatred. She had always referred to Lydia Voss using one specific, hateful phrase. "That is the old crow who ruined this family," my mother would hiss, slamming her glass down on the dining table. And now, that very same forbidden woman was sitting in the cold hallway outside my hospital room, holding a battered box of secrets, patiently waiting for me to wake up and face the truth. The name Lydia Voss acted as a harsh, violent trigger, dragging me backward into a dark maze of fragmented childhood memories. I had not heard that specific arrangement of syllables in decades, yet it instantly materialized vivid snapshots in my mind. I remembered the heavy, suffocating silence that would suddenly descend upon our mahogany dining table whenever her name accidentally slipped from a relative's mouth. I vividly recalled the sharp, tearing sound of thick paper as my mother, Elaine, viciously ripped unopened envelopes bearing a specific return address. dumping the shredded pieces straight into the kitchen trash. The justification was always delivered with a sneer, a phrase repeated so often it became an unquestionable family gospel. "She just wants to wedge her way into this family's assets," my mother would declare, aggressively wiping the counter as if scrubbing away a stain. "She is a parasite, Nora. Never forget that." When the heavy door to my hospital room finally clicked open later that morning, the supposed parasite walked in. I braced myself for a dramatic confrontation or an uncomfortable display of overwhelming, fake affection. I received neither. Lydia Voss stepped into the harsh fluorescent light with an air of quiet, absolute authority. She did not rush to the side of my bed. She did not try to hold my hand or smooth my hair. She maintained a respectful, highly professional distance, pulling the uncomfortable plastic visitor chair several feet away from my mattress. She gently placed the battered, leather-bound document box on the seat next to her, resting her gloved hands in her lap. She looked at me for a long, silent moment, her sharp gray eyes assessing the heavy toll the surgery had taken on my body. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and entirely devoid of pity. It was the voice of a woman who had come to do a job. "Nora, do you know what your grandmother Beatrice left you?" she asked. The question was so entirely unexpected that it felt like a physical blow to the chest. I stared at her, my mind scrambling to process the sheer absurdity of the inquiry. I swallowed hard against the dryness in my throat. "She left us a massive contractor debt," I answered, my voice still weak but laced with ingrained bitterness. The foundation of her old house was rotting. My parents sat me down the month after the funeral and explained that we all had to sacrifice together to pay off the remaining balance to the construction company. I gave them half my salary for 2 solid years to cover my share. Other than that, she just left a box of cheap costume jewelry. Lydia did not gasp or express theatrical shock. Her expression simply hardened, a cold, furious storm brewing behind her eyes. She reached out, unlatched the brass clasps of the worn leather box, and carefully lifted the heavy lid. "I was not merely a family friend," Lydia stated, her tone shifting into something distinctly clinical and precise. "I was Beatrice Ashmore's primary, personal financial advisor for over 25 years. I am also the legally designated keeper of her contingency records. Your grandmother was a highly intelligent woman. She saw exactly who your mother was long before anyone else did. She knew Elaine was a deeply opportunistic woman who viewed every relationship as a financial transaction." Lydia pulled a thick stack of yellowed papers from the box and rested them on her knee. "Beatrice explicitly wrote in her private directives that if, upon her passing, your family continued to treat you as an unlimited walking bank account, I was to hold this specific secondary file securely. I was legally instructed to wait until you were fully independent, mature enough, and clear-headed enough to hear the absolute truth without their manipulation clouding your judgment." She paused, letting the immense weight of her words settle into the sterile air of the room. "The truth," Lydia continued softly, "is that Beatrice established a robust, private trust fund entirely in your name. It was strictly designated to be distributed to you upon your 30th birthday. Furthermore, she assigned you the primary beneficiary rights from the liquidation of a highly lucrative commercial real estate property she owned downtown." The steady, rhythmic chiming of my heart monitor hitched, skipping a beat before racing into a rapid, panicked tempo. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperately trying to block out the room, but the numbers kept flashing in my mind. My 30th birthday was 4 long years ago. I had spent that entire year drowning in credit card debt because I had just paid off Gavin's failed marketing firm disaster. I had eaten cheap noodles for months while my parents took a luxury cruise to the Mediterranean. "I never received a single document," I whispered, the crushing realization stealing my breath. "I never saw a dime. No one from a bank ever contacted me." "I suspected as much," Lydia replied grimly, pulling a transparent plastic sleeve from the stack. Inside were several copies of official postal receipts. According to the trust administration records, every single legal notice, every tax declaration, and every distribution notification was sent via certified mail directly to your primary residential address over the past several years. However, someone deliberately intercepted them. The delivery confirmations were signed for. She stood up slowly and stepped closer to the bed, holding the plastic sleeve up to the light. "Look at the signatures on these certified delivery receipts, Nora." I leaned forward, the surgical incision in my abdomen burning fiercely, but I ignored the physical pain. I squinted at the scanned ink loops on the paper. The name signed was mine. It spelled out Nora Ashmore, but the handwriting was not mine. The aggressive slant of the letters, the sharp, hurried loops of the vowels, the heavy pressure of the pen at the end of the final letter. It was a perfect, practiced forgery. It was the exact, unmistakable cursive my mother used to sign her country club checks. A wave of profound, sickening nausea rolled through my stomach. It was not just exploitation anymore. It was not just emotional manipulation or taking advantage of my sense of duty. This was calculated, deliberate fraud. They had actively stolen my inheritance, intercepted certified mail, forged my legal signature, and then possessed the sheer, terrifying audacity to look me in the eye and demand I pay off a completely fabricated construction debt. I sank back against the pillows, feeling as though the entire hospital building had suddenly detached from its foundation and was plunging into a dark, bottomless ocean. But Lydia was not finished. She carefully placed the receipt copies back into the leather box and pulled out one final, single sheet of crisp white paper. "I did not come to this hospital solely to give you a history lesson, Nora," Lydia said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent register. "I came because someone has tried to move against the estate. As the contingency advisor, I still receive automated alerts regarding any major credit inquiries utilizing the specific assets tied to your grandmother's estate." She laid the crisp paper directly on the tray table resting over my lap. "The exact morning you were admitted to this emergency room," Lydia explained, her eyes locking onto mine with terrifying intensity, "someone submitted a massive refinancing loan application strictly under your name. The application utilized the commercial property sale proceeds from the trust as collateral proof of assets. Only a person residing inside your family, someone who had actively read the intercepted trust documents, would possess the highly specific routing numbers and asset declarations required to submit this paperwork." The walls of the room felt like they were shrinking, closing in on me with crushing force. The timeline clicked together with the lethal precision of a loaded gun. My sudden collapse in the office had not ruined their plans. It had perfectly facilitated them. They needed a massive injection of cash, likely to cover Gavin's upcoming resort investor conference. But the required paperwork needed time to process, and it needed me completely out of the way, so I would not receive the automated fraud alerts on my phone or from my bank. My catastrophic medical emergency had provided them with the perfect, uninterrupted window of silence. They had boarded that plane not because they were avoiding my hospital bed, but because they thought the financial trap had been securely set while I was unconscious. They believed I was safely asleep, totally ignorant, and entirely under their control. They did not realize that the one woman they had banished from the family had been sitting outside the glass, holding the keys to the vault. I looked down at the forged signature. I looked at the loan application. Then, I looked up at Lydia Voss. The frightened, exhausted daughter who had collapsed in her office was gone. In her place was a woman who finally understood exactly what had been done to her. "Lydia," I said, my voice finally dropping its tremor, ringing out with the sharp, ruthless clarity of a woman who managed corporate crises for a living. "Tell me exactly how we freeze everything." Lydia Voss did not say another word as she reached back into the worn leather box. Her movements were meticulous, almost reverent, as she began to lay out the physical evidence of my stolen life across the sterile plastic surface of my hospital tray table. First came a heavy, cream-colored stack of stapled paper. It was the official notarized copy of Beatrice Ashmore's last will and testament. Next to it, she placed a smaller, delicate envelope containing a handwritten letter from my grandmother. The ink faded, but the sharp, commanding script completely unmistakable. Then came the financial reality thick, bound quarterly reports detailing trust distributions, A chronologically ordered stack of dividend payment notices spanning several years, and a massive, finalized commercial real estate ledger. I forced myself to read the bottom line of the property sale document. The final, settled sum printed there was staggering. It was an amount of money easily large enough to have purchased a comfortable, two-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood entirely in cash, while simultaneously wiping out every single cent of the crushing student loans and personal credit card debt I had been desperately drowning under for my entire adult life. Instead of handing me that absolute freedom, my family had expertly, systematically trained me to believe that we were all perpetually sinking. They had manufactured a constant, suffocating state of financial peril, painting a daily masterpiece of a shared family burden that required my relentless, unquestioning sacrifice. I had been ruthlessly conditioned to empty my own meager checking account, literally starving my own future, to plug the very holes that my stolen inheritance should have naturally and easily filled. Every time they praised my strength, every time my mother tearfully thanked me for being the reliable backbone of the family, they were secretly standing on a mountain of my own withheld cash. Lydia reached deeper into the box and withdrew something that looked entirely out of place among the aged, yellowing legal documents. It was a thick, glossy, professionally bound presentation booklet. The heavy cardstock cover featured a sleek, minimalist logo for a luxury resort and wellness brand. She flipped past the ambitious title page and the aggressive, hockey stick revenue projections, landing directly on the back appendix. She tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against a specific line item listed under the financial backing and security section. There, printed in crisp, undeniable black ink, was my name. I was explicitly legally listed as the primary silent guarantor for a massive Series A funding round. It was an international joint venture for a boutique hospitality project located directly on the coast of Cancun. I stared at the glossy page, the letters swimming slightly before my eyes as my pulse hammered against my surgical stitches. I had never seen this document in my life. I had never been pitched this extravagant hospitality project. I had certainly never consented to back a high-risk international venture with my non-existent personal assets. The grotesque, sickening reality of their current trip finally snapped into sharp, horrifying focus. Gavin was not down in Mexico to relax on the white sand or celebrate a minor business milestone with a tropical cocktail. He was there to meet with a highly exclusive group of aggressive angel investors to save his rapidly sinking corporate ship. My parents had not simply tagged along to enjoy the sunshine and offer moral support. They were crucial, active props in a carefully choreographed theater production. They were there to sell the compelling, highly marketable image of a tight-knit, financially bulletproof American family dynasty, complete with a wildly successful, fiercely loyal corporate executive sister operating as their silent financial anchor back home. But the truly terrifying part, the absolute darkest layer of this massive betrayal, was the exact timeline of the new refinance loan Lydia had discovered. The application submitted on the very morning I was bleeding internally on my office floor was not merely a greedy, opportunistic cash grab. It was an act of desperate, criminal self-preservation. They needed that newly approved capital to plug the massive, bleeding holes in Gavin's failing enterprise. But more importantly, they needed it to completely cover up the fact that my trust fund had been illegally delayed, drained, and misappropriated for nearly half a decade. If Gavin's Cancun deal collapsed and his creditors came calling, the subsequent bankruptcy audit would violently rip the lid off the stolen trust fund. They had used my catastrophic medical emergency to secretly mortgage my own stolen assets, just to save themselves from federal wire fraud and forgery charges. As I sat there in the quiet, dim hospital room, the heavy, suffocating fog of familial duty that had clouded my brain for 34 years completely evaporated. A rapid, cascading series of disjointed memories suddenly aligned into a perfectly constructed, unbreakable chain of evidence. I remembered my mother aggressively insisting on keeping all my important financial and tax mail at their house after I graduated college, claiming her neighborhood mailbox was much safer than a temporary apartment building lobby. I remembered my father constantly, sternly lecturing me about the importance of keeping our legal matters strictly centralized under the family address for tax efficiency purposes. Most damning of all, I remembered a sunny Tuesday afternoon exactly 2 years ago. Gavin had called my cell phone while I was rushing between brutal corporate compliance meetings. He sounded highly stressed, complaining about a minor administrative hurdle with a graphic design vendor. He had casually asked me to email him a high-resolution digital scan of my signature, claiming he needed it just for a quick visual reference to verify a design proof on some customized family stationery he was ordering for our parents' upcoming anniversary party. I had been so exhausted, so completely drained by my own job, that I had mindlessly scribbled my name on a coffee shop napkin, scanned it with my phone camera, and hit send without a single second thought. What I had spent my entire adult life calling family support was, in stark reality, a masterfully engineered system of absolute control. It was a farm, and I was the primary isolated cash crop. They deliberately kept me exhausted. They manufactured endless petty crises to keep my anxiety levels high and my bank account perpetually low. They expertly weaponized my own guilt and my desperate, pathetic need for their approval, ensuring I was always far too busy putting out their manufactured fires to ever stop and inspect the structural integrity of my own financial house. They had built their entire comfortable, polished, upper-middle-class existence entirely upon the crushed foundation of my stolen independence. The silence in the hospital room grew incredibly heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the vital sign monitors and the distant squeak of a nurse's shoe in the hallway. Lydia watched me closely, her hands folded neatly in her lap, waiting for the inevitable emotional explosion. She was waiting for the screaming, the hot tears of betrayal, the frantic, furious phone calls demanding an immediate explanation from the beach in Mexico. But the anger that flooded my veins was not hot or explosive. It was absolute, freezing liquid nitrogen. Shouting would achieve absolutely nothing. Confronting them right now, while I was still trapped in a hospital bed and they were thousands of miles away, would only give them the critical opportunity to scramble. It would give them time to destroy digital evidence, to weave a new, even more elaborate web of legal lies, and to attempt to gaslight me back into quiet submission. I looked down at the forged delivery receipts, the stolen trust reports, and the glossy Cancun pitch deck. Then, I looked up at Lydia. I reached out and slowly closed the heavy lid of the leather box, securing the brass clasps with a firm, decisive click. "Lydia," I said, my voice dropping to a low, quiet register that I barely recognized as my own. "You are going to pack this box up right now. You are going to take it out of this hospital, and you are going to put it inside the most secure vault your advisory firm possesses. You will not contact my family. You will not give them any indication whatsoever that we have spoken or that I am awake." Lydia's sharp gray eyes gleamed with a sudden, profound flash of respect. She did not argue. She offered a single, slow nod of understanding. "And what exactly will you be doing?" "Nora, I am going to lie back down," I replied, feeling a cold, unfamiliar smile stretch tightly across my face. "I am going to rest and let the doctors heal my stomach. I am going to let my family enjoy their beautiful, sunny vacation. I am going to let them believe that their desperate plan worked perfectly, and that their loyal, obedient, exhausted daughter is still completely blind in the dark. And then, for the first time in my life, I am going to fight for myself." The sharp, rhythmic clicking of expensive heels echoing down the sterile linoleum corridor signaled her arrival long before she actually reached my room. Through the glass viewing window, I watched my mother march up to the central nurses' station. Elaine Ashmore looked absolutely radiant, sporting a flawless, deep golden tan that stood in grotesque contrast to the pale, sickly atmosphere of the intensive care unit. She wore a crisp white linen blouse and oversized designer sunglasses pushed back perfectly into her salon-styled hair. She carried herself with the aggressive, unquestionable confidence of a woman who had spent her entire adult life winning every single argument inside our family home. She did not softly ask the staff how I was doing. She did not inquire if I was in pain. Instead, She slapped her leather designer handbag onto the high counter and immediately demanded my discharge papers. Her tone was sharp and profoundly annoyed, treating the critical care ward not as a place of healing, but as a temporary, highly inconvenient storage facility that was currently holding on to a piece of family property. She wanted me extracted, packed up, and transported back to her controlled environment before any outside variables could make things complicated. Renee, the charge nurse on duty, maintained a brilliant wall of professional neutrality. She informed my mother that strict hospital protocol required the primary family contact to physically verify and sign off on the patient visitor log before any discharge discussions could even be initiated. I watched closely through the glass as Renee slid the heavy metal clipboard across the counter. My mother let out a loud, theatrical sigh of pure irritation, picking up the attached pen. She glanced down at the paper. I saw the exact second her eyes hit the ink. The haughty, irritated smile permanently fixed to her face instantly froze, then shattered completely. The rich bronze of her vacation tan could not hide the sudden, sickly pallor that drained the blood from her cheeks. She was staring at a solid, unbroken column of signatures. Night after night, line after line, the same looping cursive was printed clearly on the page Lydia Voss. Before my mother could recover enough to scream at the desk staff, the heavy double doors of the ward swung open again. My father, Richard, strode down the hallway. He did not bother stopping at the reception desk. He pushed open the door to my room, bringing the faint smell of expensive airport lounge cologne with him. He stopped at the foot of my bed. He did not ask if I was feeling better. He did not ask what the surgeon had removed or repaired. He looked down at me, his face a mask of rigid, urgent business, and delivered one single sentence. "What exactly have you signed since you woke up?" That single, chilling question was the final nail in the coffin. It instantly validated every single horrifying truth Lydia had laid out on my tray table the previous night. My father was not looking at his daughter. He was looking at a massive financial liability that had been left entirely unsupervised for 5 days. "I have not signed anything yet," I replied, my voice perfectly flat, devoid of any of the desperate, eager-to-please warmth I used to offer him. My mother rushed into the room a second later, her chest heaving, the visitor log clipboard completely forgotten at the desk. She looked wildly from me to my father, her perfectly manicured hands trembling slightly. She desperately tried to regain her footing, instantly defaulting to the familiar, heavy-handed emotional manipulation she had successfully weaponized against me for 34 years. "Nora, darling, we rushed back the absolute second we could get a flight," she breathed, forcing a thick layer of fake, honeyed concern into her voice. She stepped closer to the bed, reaching out to stroke my arm, but I deliberately pulled my hand away, resting it flat against the cold plastic railing. She blinked, thrown off by the rejection, but quickly pivoted to her favorite moral high ground. "You know how this family works. Family is about standing together when things get difficult. We share the burden." I looked directly into her perfectly lined eyes. I did not shrink back. I did not apologize for making things difficult. "Standing together?" I asked, my tone dropping to a cold, razor-sharp edge. "You mean standing together by posting pictures of your bare feet on a white sand beach with a luxury cocktail while your daughter is bleeding internally inside an intensive care unit?" The room went dead silent. The suffocating tension was suddenly broken by the loud, cheerful ringing of my cell phone resting on the bedside table, the screen illuminated, displaying an incoming video call from Gavin. My mother lunged toward the table, eager for any distraction, and hit the accept button, holding the phone up so we could all see the screen. Gavin appeared, standing in what looked like a premium airport departure lounge, wearing a very expensive linen suit. "Nora, thank God," Gavin said, immediately adopting a deeply serious, hushed tone of brotherly worry. "Mom said you were finally awake. Look, I am so sorry I'm not there, but this trip was completely unavoidable for the business. I am worried sick about you. Are you feeling well enough to look at your phone? I just need to know if the secondary underwriter contacted you about that identity verification form yet." It is just a minor compliance check, but the portal says the application is stalled until you clear it. He stopped speaking, realizing too late that the airport lounge background noise had not drowned out his own words. He had just casually, explicitly asked about the exact progress of a massive refinancing application that I was never supposed to have seen, an application submitted while I was fully anesthetized. An underwriter, I asked slowly, holding Gavin's digital gaze on the screen while simultaneously looking at my father standing at the foot of the bed. Why would a financial underwriter be waiting for my verification on a file I have never even heard of? Gavin stammered, his silver tongue suddenly turning to lead. No, I just meant a basic security check on your regular accounts, because of the hospital admission. Turn the phone off, Gavin, my father barked, his face flushing a dark, angry red. He turned to me, attempting to pull himself up to his full, intimidating height. You are clearly still disoriented from the medication. Nora, we are taking you home right now. We can handle the administration details later. I am not going anywhere with you, I said softly. Do not be ridiculous, my mother snapped, the fake sweetness entirely evaporating, replaced by the harsh, demanding tone she used on disobedient children. You cannot stay here. You need us to manage your recovery. I do not need you to manage anything, I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable authority. I pressed the call button clipped to my blanket. The door opened instantly. Nurse Renee stepped inside, her posture rigid and alert, but she was not alone. Stepping out from the shadows of the hallway, directly into the harsh fluorescent light of my room, was Lydia Voss. My mother physically recoiled, stumbling backward until her shoulders hit the wall. A raw, unadulterated sound of pure panic escaped her throat. My father froze, his eyes locking onto the older woman who had been banished from our lives 2 decades ago. Renee is here as an independent witness from the hospital staff, I announced to the room, ignoring my parents' shock. I looked directly at my mother, watching the blood completely drain from her face for the second time that hour. I am formally notifying you that as of 12 hours ago, I have legally removed Richard and Elaine Ashmore from all of my emergency contact lists. I have revoked every single medical disclosure authorization. I have locked down every bank account bearing my name, changed all routing protocols, and placed a hard federal freeze on my social security number to block any pending external verifications. You cannot do that, my father practically roared, stepping toward the bed, his hands balled into tight fists. You have obligations to this family. My only obligation was to survive, I fired back, leaning forward despite the sharp, burning agony in my stitched abdomen. And I did that completely without you, Elaine finally snapped. The polished, sophisticated matriarch completely vanished, replaced by a terrified, cornered animal who realized the trap had just snapped shut on her own leg. She pointed a shaking finger at Lydia. You did this, my mother shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the tile walls. You poisoned her mind against us. You waited until she was weak and you crawled right back in to steal what belongs to this family. Nothing here belongs to you, Elaine, Lydia replied calmly, her voice a cool, soothing balm against my mother's hysterical screaming. And Nora is not weak. She is simply awake. My mother stared at me, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. She knew exactly what Lydia's presence in this room meant. She knew that the carefully constructed, decade-long narrative of the selfless, struggling family relying on the dutiful daughter had just been entirely incinerated. If I was fully awake, completely lucid, and standing firmly alongside Lydia Voss, the massive, illegal financial house of cards they had built upon my back was going to collapse directly onto their heads. And for the very first time in my entire life, I was not going to reach out my hand to catch them. I stretched my hospital stay to the absolute maximum limit my doctors and insurance would allow. I utilized every single hour of medical observation available to me, citing lingering nausea and severe dizziness. The truth was, my mind had never been clearer, but I needed the physical fortress of the intensive care ward to keep my family away while I laid the groundwork for my next move. When the attending physician finally signed my formal release papers, I did not call a taxi to take me back to my parents' house. For decades, their home had been the ultimate trap, cleverly disguised as a sanctuary of care. If I went back there to recover, I would be subjected to a relentless campaign of suffocating affection, dietary policing, and subtle psychological pressure until I finally broke down and signed whatever legal documents they pushed in front of me. Instead, I walked out of the hospital lobby and stepped into a sleek black car arranged entirely by Lydia Voss. She had secured a short-term, fully furnished corporate apartment for me on the complete opposite side of the city. It was a sterile, high-rise unit with floor-to-ceiling windows, white leather furniture, and absolutely zero emotional history. It did not smell like my mother's expensive perfumes, and it did not echo with my father's booming reprimands. It was not a home. It was a war room. My daily corporate life as a compliance manager was built entirely on identifying discrepancies, auditing paper trails, and catching microscopic errors in massive logistical frameworks. My family had severely underestimated exactly what I did for a living. I did not just manage spreadsheets, I dismantled deception for a paycheck. Now, I was simply applying my professional expertise to my own life. Within 24 hours of moving into the apartment, I retained the services of an independent digital forensics specialist. I handed over my personal laptop, my old desktop hard drive, and the login credentials to every single email account I had opened since college. I instructed him to run a comprehensive audit on electronic signature logs, hidden email forwarding protocols, deleted cloud backups, and historical device access records. I sat at the glass dining table with a cup of herbal tea, my healing abdomen wrapped tightly in medical binders, and watched the specialist work. It took him less than 2 days to crack the carefully constructed facade wide open. The first major revelation was a masterclass in quiet, sustained sabotage. The forensics expert discovered a highly specific, hidden filtering rule buried deep inside the settings of my oldest primary personal email address. Any incoming message containing keywords related to trust distributions, estate taxes, or asset management was automatically marked as read, instantly archived, and then silently forwarded to a secondary account controlled entirely by my father. Simultaneously, physical mailing addresses on my official banking profiles had been subtly altered. Official notifications regarding my grandmother's estate had been steadily diverted to my parents' suburban address for years. I had never seen the letters because they had never actually reached my mailbox. The second discovery was significantly more sinister. We pulled the metadata from the fraudulent refinancing application that had been submitted while I was bleeding on my office floor. My family had not just hastily forged my signature with a pen. They had utilized a high-resolution scanner to lift my exact, authentic signature from a vehicle lease agreement I had signed exactly 3 years ago. They digitally isolated the ink, scrubbed the background, and seamlessly spliced it onto the bottom line of Gavin's desperate corporate loan package. It was not a crime of passion or a sudden moment of panic. It was a premeditated, highly technical act of identity theft. But the final piece of evidence we pulled from the digital wreckage was the one that finally killed whatever lingering, pathetic shreds of familial loyalty I still harbored. For my entire adult life, I had convinced myself that Gavin was merely collateral damage in our parents' schemes. I wanted to believe he was just a beautifully oblivious golden boy, completely unaware of the massive financial bloodletting occurring behind the scenes to fund his extravagant lifestyle. I needed to believe he was innocent. But the forensic sweep recovered a cache of deleted text messages from a synchronized cloud backup attached to his old business tablet. The text thread was between Gavin and our mother, dated just 2 weeks before my physical collapse. They were discussing the upcoming deadline for the Cancun venture capital pitch. I attached the guarantor forms to the back of the deck. Gavin had written, "Are you sure she's not going to notice the asset collateral page?" My mother had replied immediately, "She is working 14-hour shifts this week. She is far too exhausted to read anything past the first paragraph. I will hand it to her when she stops by for dinner. Just make sure she does not read it closely before Monday," Gavin texted back. If she actually looks at the routing numbers, the entire deal is completely dead. I stared at the glowing screen of the laptop, reading those exact words over and over again. My brother did not just blindly accept the money I bled to give him. He actively conspired to keep me in the dark. He relied on my profound exhaustion. He banked on my physical and mental burnout to sneak a fraudulent contract past my eyes. He viewed my unquestioning trust not as a gift, but as a strategic vulnerability to be ruthlessly exploited. My phone vibrated continuously on the glass table. Over the past 3 days, I had accumulated over 4 dozen missed calls and a mountain of frantic voicemails from my parents and my brother. They were desperately trying to locate me. The tone of their messages swung wildly between tearful, begging concern and sharp, authoritative anger. They demanded to know which recovery center I had been transferred to. They insisted I was behaving erratically due to the anesthesia. They needed me to call them back immediately so we could just be a family again. I did not return a single call. I did not send a single text message. I did not post any dramatic, cryptic updates on social media. I maintained absolute, terrifying radio silence. I let them spiral into the void. By refusing to engage, I was letting them continue to believe their own convenient narrative. I let them think I was still weak, still thoroughly confused, and still easily manipulated. I wanted them to believe that if they just found the right angle, they could coax their obedient, exhausted workhorse back into the stable. Panic makes arrogant people careless, and I needed them to make a massive mistake. Later that evening, Lydia Voss arrived at the apartment. She walked in, hung her gray coat by the door, and joined me at the glass table. She looked at the stacks of printed forensic reports, her sharp eyes scanning the undeniable proof of the fraud. She did not offer empty apologies for my pain. Instead, she reached into her leather handbag and pulled out the delicate, aged envelope containing the final handwritten letter from my grandmother Beatrice. She slid the envelope across the smooth glass until it rested right in front of my hands. "I am officially transferring this into your custody," Lydia said softly. "But my professional and personal advice to you, Nora, is to leave it sealed for now. Do not open it tonight. You have absorbed enough heartbreak for 1 week. Right now, you are building a legal guillotine. Do not let sentimentality blunt your focus. Keep this letter closed. Let it become the final blade you drop on them, not the first tear you shed." I looked at my grandmother's elegant, sloping handwriting spelling out my name on the aged paper. I nodded slowly, picked up the envelope, and placed it safely inside my locked briefcase next to the forensic data drives. Lydia was right. This was no longer about seeking closure or understanding why they did not love me enough. This was about total, absolute reclamation. After Lydia left the apartment, I sat alone in the dark living room, illuminated only by the cool blue light of my computer screen. Armed with the correct routing numbers, the recovered legal codes, and the unblocked digital access Lydia had painstakingly preserved, I opened the primary web portal for the private asset management firm that held my grandmother's estate. I bypassed my parents' fraudulent email barriers. I typed in my legal name, entered the newly generated secure passwords, and verified my identity using my newly established burner phone. The system authenticated my credentials. A loading circle spun in the center of the screen for 2 agonizing seconds. Then, the main dashboard materialized. I sat completely frozen, the air trapped in my lungs. I stared at the bold black numbers displayed at the top of the account summary page. It was the total value of the liquidated commercial property and the accumulated compound interest from the trust over the past 4 years. It was a staggering, breathtaking amount of wealth. It was the kind of money that fundamentally changes the trajectory of a human life. It was the security I had cried myself to sleep praying for when I could barely afford my heating bill. It was the ultimate freedom I had been aggressively denied while I was dutifully paying off my brother's reckless debts. Looking at that massive number shining on the screen, the final piece of my reality shattered and rearranged itself. I finally understood the terrifying depth of their crime. They had not merely neglected me. They had not just taken advantage of my kindness. They had actively, systematically stolen a completely different version of my life, rewriting my entire existence behind my back so they could comfortably live inside the one I was supposed to have. It took less than 7 days for the absolute panic to completely consume them. The moment the automated rejection notices started hitting their inboxes and their debit cards began bouncing at the country club, my newly acquired burner phone exploded. The digital barricade I had erected around my finances acted like a magnifying glass, exposing their deep desperation in high definition. My mother was the first to deploy her weapons, sending a relentless barrage of tearful voice notes. She sobbed heavily into the microphone, accusing me of abandoning the family in our darkest hour, begging me to just answer the phone so we could fix this terrible, heartbreaking misunderstanding. When her theatrical tears failed to yield a response, my father immediately took over. His text messages were cold, hard, and laced with the kind of authoritative intimidation he usually reserved for his corporate subordinates. He ordered me to unlock the primary banking routing numbers immediately, warning me that I was crossing a dangerous line I would deeply regret for the rest of my life. Then came Gavin. My brother's approach was a masterclass in psychological whiplash. At 8 o'clock in the morning, he texted me long, rambling paragraphs playing the innocent victim, claiming he was entirely out of the loop and just wanted his big sister back. By noon, when the first critical deadline for his Cancun deal likely passed without my authorized funds clearing the account, his tone turned vicious and ugly. He dropped the sweet brother act entirely. He accused me of being a bitter, deeply jealous sibling actively trying to sabotage his one big break. "If you make a massive fuss right now," Gavin wrote in a furious message, "you are going to completely ruin the one chance I have to change our lives. You are being incredibly selfish." That single sentence laid their entire generational playbook completely bare. They had always taken his relentless, bottomless greed and expertly dressed it up in the noble, untouchable costume of our shared family future. To them, my money was never mine. It was the fuel for their collective ambition. By the 5th day of my silence, my mother changed her strategy. Realizing that anger was not working, she sent a highly urgent, seemingly frantic email to my corporate work address. She claimed that my father was scheduled for an incredibly expensive, highly necessary medical procedure by the end of the week. She wrote that because I had selfishly frozen the accounts, they could not cover the massive copayment required by the surgical center. It was a perfectly designed, expertly crafted guilt trip, tailored specifically to target the dutiful, anxious daughter who had just barely survived her own severe medical emergency. But the version of me they relied on was gone. I opened my laptop and logged directly into the shared family health insurance portal, an administrative chore I had silently handled for them for over a decade. It took me exactly 2 minutes to review his medical chart. The minor cardiac test she was referencing had been officially rescheduled by his doctor over 4 months ago. There was absolutely no impending surgery. The real terrifying crisis was hiding in a separate digital tab on the forensic report pulled from Gavin's compromised tablet backup. A non-refundable deposit of hundreds of thousands of dollars for the luxury resort partnership was due in exactly 48 hours. The fraudulent refinancing loan they had submitted in my name was completely stalled without my final verified signature. They were entirely out of money, and they were running out of time. Realizing that digital threats and fabricated medical emergencies were failing to draw me out, my mother finally sent the ultimate concession. She formally invited me to a private family dinner at their house on Thursday evening. She promised, writing in an overly sweet, placating tone, that they would lay absolutely everything out on the table. They would explain the complex financial overlap, formally apologize for any undue stress they caused during my hospitalization, and smooth things over permanently so we could move forward together. I knew exactly what that dinner actually represented. They did not want to apologize, and they certainly did not want to explain anything. They desperately needed my physical presence. They needed me sitting in their dining room, preferably looking weak, confused, and easily bullied, so they could corner me into signing the final legal release forms for the underwriter. They needed to present a unified happy, stable family to whatever third-party investor was actively demanding proof of my silent guarantor status. I replied with a single, brief email. I agreed to attend the dinner on Thursday night at 7 o'clock sharp. However, I explicitly stated my one non-negotiable condition: I would only sit down if every single piece of financial documentation, including the trust ledgers, the real estate contracts, and the loan applications, was placed directly on the dining table for my immediate, unhindered review. I hit send, deliberately choosing not to mention that Lydia Voss had already spent the entire morning making highly confidential, devastating phone calls. She had already contacted the executive director of the lending agency reviewing Gavin's fraudulent loan, as well as the senior legal counsel overseeing my grandmother's trust. The trap was already completely set. I just needed them to walk into the room. While I waited for Thursday to arrive, I sat alone in my quiet, sterile apartment and finally reached for the delicate envelope Lydia had given me. I carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the thick, aged paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Beatrice Ashmore's, elegant, but carrying a sharp, uncompromising weight. "My dearest Nora," the letter began. "If Lydia has handed you this paper, it means my deepest fears have unfortunately materialized. You have been left to bleed by the very people who were supposed to protect you. I am writing this to tell you a truth that took me far too many decades to learn. The most terrifying person in a family is not the one who screams the loudest. It is the one who quietly, expertly turns your natural kindness into a permanent, unbreakable obligation." I traced the faded ink with my index finger, feeling a hard, heavy knot form in my chest. The letter continued, pulling away the final, heaviest curtain of my mother's decades of deception. "Elaine will undoubtedly tell you that everything she does is to keep a roof over your head. She will demand your endless gratitude. Do not give it to her. You must know the truth. Nora, the beautiful, sprawling house they currently live in, the exact home you grew up in, was not purchased with Richard's hard work. It was bought using a massive, authorized advance distribution directly from your own trust fund. I legally permitted it only because Elaine swore to me she was keeping the assets within the family for your eventual benefit. I was a fool to believe her, and I will not let you pay for my mistake anymore. The house is yours." I stopped reading and stared blankly at the white wall of my apartment. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was almost impossible to process. The grand, expensive suburban house that I had spent my entire life feeling deeply indebted to, the house where I had scrubbed floors, paid for endless roof repairs, and sacrificed my own youth to maintain, was literally bought with my own stolen money. They had been sleeping in a castle built entirely on my delayed inheritance, and then they possessed the sheer, sickening audacity to charge me emotional rent in the form of endless, crushing guilt. I carefully folded the letter and placed it inside my leather handbag, right next to the thick stack of forensic audit reports. The dull, persistent ache of my surgical wound was entirely gone, completely replaced by a vibrating, electric sense of absolute purpose. I walked into the bathroom and looked closely at my reflection in the mirror. I did not look like the exhausted, frightened, desperate woman who had collapsed on a cold office floor just 2 weeks ago. My eyes were clear, sharp, and utterly devoid of mercy. For my entire life, my primary, unspoken role in the Ashmore family had been to silently absorb their spectacular failures, cushion their reckless falls, and constantly say yes to their endless, greedy demands. But as I dressed for the dinner, buttoning a sharp dark blazer over my healing abdomen, I made a final, unbreakable promise to myself. I was not just going to walk into their beautiful, stolen house and simply say no. A simple refusal was far too kind, far too easy for them to spin into another false narrative of my supposed selfishness. Tonight, sitting at that grand dining table, I was going to strip away every single comfortable illusion they had ever hidden behind. I was going to take the suffocating, terrifying sensation of the solid ground suddenly and violently vanishing from beneath my feet, the exact feeling they had forced me to live with for 34 years, and I was going to hand it directly back to them. Exactly 24 hours before I was scheduled to walk into my parents' dining room, Lydia Voss returned to my temporary apartment. She did not bring the heavy leather box this time. Instead, she carried a single, slender black folder. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely from the previous week. We were no longer excavating the past. We were actively loading the weapon. Lydia sat across from me at the glass table and opened the folder. Inside was a meticulously highlighted series of bank transaction records dating back over half a decade. This was the final, darkest layer of the financial autopsy. "I pulled the exact routing history for the commercial property your grandmother Beatrice owned," Lydia explained, her voice dropping into a quiet, grim register. "The building was liquidated precisely 6 years ago. The capital gains were substantial. According to the absolute letter of the trust, that entire sum was to be wired directly into a newly established account under your exclusive control." I looked down at the highlighted lines. "But it never reached me." "No," Lydia agreed. "It was intercepted. Richard utilized a highly obscure, predatory administrative loophole. He submitted a formal letter to the original, now retired trust administrator, claiming you were suffering from severe chronic mental instability due to corporate burnout. He argued that handing you a massive lump sum would be highly destructive to your fragile psychiatric state. He requested the funds be held in trust within a secondary family portfolio until you were deemed stable enough to manage your own life." I stared at the paper, a cold, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. There was absolutely no medical diagnosis attached to that claim. There was no official court order granting my father conservatorship. There was no signed document from me waiving my beneficiary rights. There was only a series of shady, aggressive wire transfers flowing out of the primary estate, passing briefly through an offshore holding account controlled entirely by my father, and then immediately scattering like cockroaches into the dark corners of their lavish lifestyle. I traced the numbers with my finger, translating the printed figures into the stolen years of my life. Tens of thousands of dollars bled out to cover the massive down payment on their sprawling suburban home. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were quietly siphoned off to restructure my parents' compounding credit card debts. And then, there were the massive, regular injections of seed capital funneled directly into Gavin's endless string of failed startup companies. They had literally paved their pristine, upper-middle-class driveway with my stolen independence. But the folder held one more piece of paper, and it was the one that finally pushed the narrative from simple greed into a realm of pure, sociopathic manipulation. It was a digital copy of a highly exclusive event itinerary, recovered from the cloud backup of Gavin's business tablet. The Cancun trip was never just a desperate scramble to save a sinking hospitality company. It was a carefully orchestrated, high-society theatrical production. "Gavin is not just seeking a financial lifeline from that investor group," Lydia stated, watching my eyes scan the document. "He is actively planning to propose to the primary investor's daughter this coming weekend. They are purchasing a custom 5-carat diamond ring using the exact funds they drained from your dividend account last month." The sickening reality of their Mexican vacation fully crystallized in my mind. The Ashmore family was not just selling a business pitch, they were selling an entire fabricated dynasty. They were presenting themselves to this billionaire investor as a profoundly wealthy, highly stable family unit, anchored by a successful sister they claimed would always back them. While I was lying unconscious in an intensive care unit, suffocating under the physical weight of the stress they had intentionally manufactured, they had not merely abandoned me, they had actively weaponized my absence. My silence and my physical distance were absolute requirements for their performance. If I were awake and present, I might have asked the wrong question or refused the wrong signature, shattering the immaculate illusion they were selling on that white sand beach. They needed me to be a silent name on a piece of paper, one that generated money while they elevated their status in front of strangers. They did not just steal my money. They had systematically dismantled my actual life, piece by piece, and used the raw materials to construct a glittering, hollow mansion for themselves. "We are ready," Lydia announced, breaking the heavy silence in the room. She pulled a small, encrypted mobile device from her pocket and placed it on the table. I have spent the last 48 hours coordinating with the necessary parties. Tomorrow evening, at exactly 7:30, a secure conference line will open. I will have the senior legal counsel for the Beatrice Ashmore estate, an executive fraud investigator from the commercial lending agency handling Gavin's current application, and an independent digital signature verification specialist waiting on standby. They will all be dialed in, fully briefed, and completely muted. They will hear every single word spoken in that dining room. All you have to do is tap the screen. I did not flinch. I did not express hesitation. I simply nodded. I made a conscious, deliberate choice not to issue a single warning. I did not send an angry text message demanding the truth. I did not call my mother to scream about the forged signature. I chose to let them continue breathing their own toxic, comfortable air. I wanted Elaine to spend her entire Thursday afternoon happily arranging expensive imported flowers on her long mahogany dining table, completely convinced that her charming maternal routine was going to work flawlessly yet again. I wanted Richard to stand in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his expensive silk tie, carefully rehearsing the stern, booming moral lecture he planned to deliver about my familial duties. I wanted Gavin to sit at that table, scrolling through luxury real estate listings on his phone, entirely confident that his familiar, exhausted victim was slowly dragging herself back into her designated, miserable orbit to save his skin one more time. Deep inside my own chest, the landscape had become utterly barren and cold. For 34 years, every single action I took was driven by a desperate, pathetic starvation for their love. I had wanted them to recognize my sacrifices. I had wanted them to look at me, truly look at me, and feel a shred of genuine remorse for how heavily they leaned on my shoulders. But as I sat there visualizing the upcoming dinner, I realized with chilling clarity that I no longer wanted their love. I did not want their validation. I did not even want their apologies, because I knew any apology they offered would simply be another calculated manipulation. What I wanted was something far more absolute. I wanted the undeniable, ugly truth to be dragged out into the harsh light and slammed directly onto the center of their beautiful dining table at the exact, precise moment they firmly believed they had finally won the game. I wanted to watch the realization hit their eyes. When Thursday evening finally arrived, the sky outside my window was a bruised, darkening purple. I did not wear the soft, oversized sweaters or the sensible, muted colors my mother always subtly pressured me into wearing to make myself look smaller and less intimidating. I dressed with the cold, sharp precision of a corporate executioner. I put on a tailored, structured black blazer, a crisp white shirt, and a pair of dark trousers that hid the medical binders wrapped around my healing stomach. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe style, completely stripping away the soft, approachable facade I had worn my entire life. I picked up my leather briefcase. Inside was the encrypted mobile device Lydia had provided, the thick stack of forensic financial audits, and the aged envelope containing the final handwritten letter from my grandmother. I walked out of the sterile apartment and stepped into the waiting car. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, heading toward the wealthy suburbs, my heartbeat was incredibly slow and perfectly steady. I was not a terrified daughter driving home to beg her parents for basic human understanding. I was the very last person walking into the room, carrying the absolute authority to permanently shut down a massive, generational machine of deception that had been allowed to run for far too long. The evening began exactly as I had anticipated, a perfectly choreographed performance of domestic bliss designed entirely to disarm me. I walked through the heavy oak front doors of the house that my own stolen inheritance had helped purchase. Elaine greeted me with a fragile, overly gentle smile, her voice dripping with manufactured maternal warmth as she ushered me toward the formal dining room. Richard stood near the head of the long mahogany table, swirling a glass of expensive scotch, offering a tight, forced nod while muttering something vague about unfortunate familial misunderstandings that simply needed to be ironed out. Gavin was already seated, expertly playing the role of the wounded, unfairly persecuted younger brother. He looked down at his empty plate, looking suitably chastised, yet perfectly styled in a cashmere sweater. The centerpiece of the table was not the elaborate floral arrangement my mother had meticulously prepared. It was a thick, pristine stack of legal documents resting casually right next to my dinner plate. A sleek black pen placed neatly on top of it. They treated the paperwork as if it were merely a trivial afterthought, a minor administrative detail to quickly brush past before the main course was served. As soon as I took my seat, the coordinated assault began. They laid out a fabricated narrative woven with desperate promises. They explained that a massive, unexpected delay had threatened the Cancun resort deal, and they desperately needed my signature on this simple financial support confirmation to reassure a highly anxious investor group. In exchange for this one tiny favor, Richard promised they would completely restructure the family finances, finally creating a system where I would receive a significant percentage of all future profits. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my fists against the polished wood. I looked at the glossy paperwork, then shifted my gaze to my mother's flawlessly made-up face. "If everything here is entirely transparent and perfectly legal," I asked, my voice barely above a whisper but cutting through the room like a silver blade, "then why did the name Lydia Voss make you turn completely pale at the hospital reception desk?" The entire room froze. The suffocating silence was absolute. My father stopped swirling his scotch. Gavin's head snapped up, his wounded expression instantly replaced by genuine, naked panic. My mother's mouth opened and closed twice before she could formulate a response, her eyes darting frantically toward my father for support. As Elaine finally opened her mouth to launch into a frantic, defensive lie about Lydia being a delusional, bitter old woman, I reached into my pocket. I pulled out the encrypted mobile device Lydia had given me, placed it firmly in the center of the table, and tapped the illuminated speaker icon. A crisp, professional voice immediately echoed through the quiet dining room. It was the senior executive fraud investigator from the commercial lending agency. "This is to formally confirm," the voice stated clearly, "that the refinancing application submitted under the name Nora Ashmore has been indefinitely suspended. Our internal audit department has identified multiple severe discrepancies, including credible signs of forged guarantor signatures and false declarations about family assets used as collateral. The file is currently being prepared for federal review." Richard violently pushed his chair back, the heavy wood scraping loudly against the floorboards as he stood up. Gavin slammed his hands on the table and loudly swore, his polished facade shattering completely. Elaine lunged forward, her hands outstretched, desperately trying to snatch the encrypted device off the table. I swiftly moved the phone out of her reach and casually placed the thick stack of forensic audit files right where the device had been. I spread the papers across the mahogany surface like a dealer laying out a losing hand of cards. "Here is the mail redirection log, proving you intercepted my certified bank notices for the past 6 years, I said, my voice cold and steady, entirely untouched by their exploding panic. "Here is the official digital signature verification report, confirming you lifted my name from an old vehicle lease to illegally back Gavin's sinking resort deal. And here are the comprehensive trust fund statements detailing the hundreds of thousands of dollars you illegally withheld from me," citing a completely fabricated mental instability claim. They stared at the documents, the undeniable, printed proof of their crimes staring back at them. But I was not finished. I reached into my blazer and pulled out the aged, delicate envelope. I broke the seal and unfolded the handwritten pages. "This is from Grandmother Beatrice," I announced, holding the paper up. I did not yell, but my voice commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. I read her final, damning words directly into their faces. She wrote that if a day ever came when Nora was left behind at her absolute weakest moment, while the very people bleeding her dry calmly boarded an airplane for a luxury vacation, Lydia was instructed to hand over the entire legal file immediately. In that specific moment, the profound, heavy meaning of the woman sitting outside my hospital room finally burst wide open. Lydia had not come to the intensive care unit out of morbid curiosity. She had not come because of some vague, lingering sense of emotional debt. She had come because she was executing the final, brilliant promise she had made to my grandmother. Beatrice was the only person who had ever truly looked at our family and seen my exact fate. She had known they would eventually abandon me when I was no longer useful, and she had armed Lydia with the exact weapon needed to save my life. I placed the letter on top of the forensic reports and looked at the three strangers sitting around the table. I have officially submitted a formal legal request for a full, unredacted audit of the entire trust, I declared, my tone indicating absolute finality. I have placed a permanent federal freeze on every single piece of financial documentation bearing my name. I have already initiated civil proceedings to completely reclaim every single asset you misappropriated over the past 6 years. From this exact second forward, not a single one of you is legally permitted to touch my name, my money, or my life. The unbreakable family unit, the one that had flawlessly bonded together for decades to systematically drain my resources, disintegrated in a matter of seconds. Gavin cracked first. He pointed a shaking finger at our mother, viciously blaming her for intercepting the mail and orchestrating the cover-up. Elaine shrieked, spinning around to accuse Richard, screaming that he was the one who had handled all the complicated financial maneuvers and offshore transfers. Richard roared over both of them, his face purple with rage, shouting that they had all happily spent the money and enjoyed the lavish lifestyle my stolen inheritance had provided. They turned on each other like starving wolves, tearing their own carefully crafted dynasty to shreds the absolute moment the hard evidence trapped them in a corner. I did not stay to watch the rest of the carnage. The ending of my old life did not conclude with a dramatic screaming match or a tearful breakdown. It ended with an absolute, freezing silence on my end. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my blazer. I left the massive pile of documents, the forged loan application, and my grandmother's letter resting right next to the untouched dinner plates. I turned my back on them and walked out of the grand, sprawling house that had been purchased with my own stolen future. When I stepped out into the cool evening air, the heavy, suffocating weight I had carried on my shoulders for 34 years was entirely gone. A sleek black car was idling by the curb at the end of the driveway. Inside, Lydia Voss was waiting patiently. As I opened the passenger door and slid into the seat, I realized something incredibly profound. For the very first time in my entire life, I no longer had to lay awake at night wondering who my real family was. The answer was incredibly simple. My family was the person who sat outside a cold glass window every single night, waiting patiently in the dark, asking for absolutely nothing from me, but showing up anyway. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below so we can interact and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even further by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.